The wind that swept across rural Texas in the summer of 1958 carried more than the dry dust of forgotten roads, it carried whispers. Whispers of a young woman named Clara Reynolds, who vanished one scorching July evening without leaving a single trace behind. Her disappearance would ripple through generations, turning a quiet farming town into a place haunted not by ghosts, but by questions. Clara was 21. A waitress at Miller's Diner, the kind of place where everyone knew your order before you sat down. She lived in a modest home on the outskirts of Denton County with her mother, a school teacher, and her younger brother. On the night she vanished, witnesses recalled seeing her lock up the diner around 9:15 p.m., waving goodbye to a truck driver who stopped by for coffee. His name was never confirmed. After that, the night swallowed her whole. When the sun rose, her mother found her room untouched, bed neatly made, uniform folded on the chair, her cross necklace hanging where she always left it. The family car was still in the driveway. But Clara was gone. At first, the sheriff believed she might have eloped. A runaway story. Small towns love those. But as the hours turned to days, and days into weeks, the rumors began to twist. Some said they saw headlights near the old quarry after midnight. Others swore they heard a scream carried by the wind. But no one came forward officially. Fear in a small town is quiet, polite, and deadly. The search parties combed through the brush, drained part of the quarry, and questioned half the county. They found nothing but a broken locket chain near the dirt road leading to her home. No body, no signs of struggle, just emptiness. Years later, the case file would be labeled in red ink, Unsolved. But in 2018, 60 years after Clara disappeared, a construction project unearthed something buried beneath an abandoned church foundation just outside of Denton. And what they found would rewrite everything the town thought it knew about what happened that night in 1958. Because among the fragments of stone and time, they found Clara's name again. The discovery in 2018 wasn't just another lead, it was the key that reopened a case buried in silence for 6 decades. Construction workers, clearing ground for a new community center, uncovered an old cellar beneath the ruins of the St. Mary's Chapel, a church that had burned down in the late 1960s. Inside that cellar were remnants of a woman's shoe, fragments of human bone, and a rusted locket with the initials CIA etched faintly on its back. When the Denton County Sheriff's Department received the call, the scene quickly transformed into a forensic excavation. Detectives cordoned off the site as forensic anthropologists and crime scene analysts descended on the area. The first question was obvious: could these remains belong to Clara Reynolds? DNA testing took weeks, but even before the results came back, investigators were uncovering peculiar details. In a town that had long buried its secrets, old records began to surface. A surviving church ledger revealed that St. Mary's Chapel had once been the property of the Anderson family, a powerful ranching family in the 1950s, deeply connected to local politics. One name stood out among the list of members: Reverend Paul Anderson, the pastor during the time Clara disappeared. The name rang a quiet alarm in the minds of investigators. Paul Anderson's reputation in town had always been spotless, but when they dug deeper into archived police notes, something unsettling emerged. In 1958, Anderson was briefly questioned, not as a suspect, but as the last person to have seen Clara alive. Old reports showed that Clara had attended a late-night youth service at St. Mary's the week before she vanished. A close friend, now in her 80s, recalled that Clara confided she'd been receiving unwanted attention from someone older, someone respected. She never mentioned a name, but her fear was real. For decades, the Anderson family name shielded the Reverend from scrutiny. The church burned down in 1969 after a mysterious fire, officially ruled an accident. But the fire's timing raised questions. By then, Paul Anderson had left Denton for a mission post in Arizona and passed away in 1975. As the forensic report came back, the remains were confirmed to be female, age estimated between 20 and 25, consistent with Clara. The DNA profile matched distant relatives of the Reynolds family, an undeniable link. But there was something even more haunting. Near the skeleton's wrist was a rusted bracelet engraved with a date, July 18, 1958, the night Clara vanished. It wasn't just a burial site. It was a secret grave, hidden beneath a church that once preached salvation. Investigators now faced a chilling question: who buried Clara there, and how much did the townspeople truly know? That's when they turned to the remaining witnesses. The ones who were children back then, but remembered the whispers their parents never dared to repeat. One name came up again and again: Sheriff Harold Boone. Boone had led the original investigation in 1958. He was known as the town's moral compass, a man of faith and law. But records showed inconsistencies in his reports, missing pages, and unexplained evidence transfers. Was the sheriff protecting someone? Or was he part of something far darker buried in Denton's past? 60 years later, the investigation had only just begun. As the investigation deepened, a pattern of silence began to fracture. Sheriff Boone's old case files, thought to be lost in a 1974 courthouse flood, resurfaced in an evidence archive in Austin. They were water-stained, brittle, but intact enough to reveal something shocking, an unsigned confession draft. It wasn't Boone's handwriting. But the letterhead was official, Denton County Sheriff's Department, July 1958. The note read, "She was frightened. I tried to tell him to stop. He said she'd ruin everything. I didn't mean for her to die." The signature space was blank, but two sets of fingerprints were faintly visible. One matched Boone, the other was partial, too degraded to identify. Forensic experts applied new chemical luminance techniques to recover ink patterns and aging oils. The partial fingerprint, cross-referenced with preserved glass items from St. Mary's Chapel, revealed a 99% match to Reverend Paul Anderson. The implications were devastating. The town's most trusted spiritual figure wasn't just connected, he was the prime suspect all along. Investigators began reconstructing the likely events of that night. Clara, after choir practice, stayed behind to speak privately with Reverend Anderson about something troubling her. Church records showed she'd been volunteering as a youth mentor, a role that kept her in close contact with him. It's believed that confrontation turned fatal. The confession implied a struggle, perhaps a panic. The cellar, which had once served as storage for church donations, became the site of a hurried cover-up. Sheriff Boone, torn between duty and loyalty to the town's powerful families, may have helped conceal the truth. But why? The Anderson family had deep influence in Denton County politics. Reverend Anderson's brother was a state senator. Boone's career, and the entire county's reputation, rested on their support. A scandal of this magnitude would have destroyed them all in the 1950s. In exchange for his silence, Boone's department received unprecedented funding in the years that followed. Roads were paved, the courthouse rebuilt. It all looked like progress, until now. When these findings became public in 2019, Denton was shaken. Families who had lived their whole lives under the shadow of the church's steeple began questioning everything they thought they knew. Local newspapers ran the headline, "The Reverend Sin, Truth Unearthed in Texas Cold Case." The town's historical society held an emergency meeting. They voted unanimously to exhume Reverend Anderson's body for further testing, an extraordinary step that reignited national attention. The DNA analysis of the exhumed remains revealed a trace match to a hair strand recovered from Clara's bracelet. That single thread, preserved through decades of dust and decay, tied the Reverend to her final moments. After 60 years, the case of Clara Reynolds was officially ruled homicide. But the story didn't end there. Hidden within Boone's recovered files was one last piece of evidence, an old black and white photo. It showed Reverend Anderson and a young woman standing outside St. Mary's, sunlight casting long shadows behind them. In the Reverend's hand, faint but visible, was the same locket found buried beside Clara's remains. The truth had always been there, buried beneath layers of guilt, power, and faith. It just took 6 decades for it to breathe again. The revelation tore through Denton like a storm that had been gathering for generations. Overnight, the town that once prided itself on faith and tradition became the epicenter of one of Texas's most haunting reckonings. News vans crowded the narrow Main Street. The old chapel, once a symbol of sanctuary, was cordoned off with yellow tape and guarded as a crime scene. A place that had baptized children, hosted weddings, and comforted mourners was now a monument to deceit and buried truth. Locals stood in stunned silence. Some wept. Others denied it all. Reverend Anderson would never, one elderly woman told a reporter, clutching her rosary. He was God's man. But the DNA didn't lie. The photo didn't lie. The silence of 60 years finally broke, echoing through every brick of St. Mary's. The town council convened an emergency meeting. After days of debate and outrage, they voted to demolish the church. For many, it felt like sacrilege. For others, it was justice long delayed. The mayor, whose father had served under Sheriff Boone, spoke solemnly, "We cannot change what happened, but we can make sure no one forgets it." In the place where the chapel once stood, they erected a memorial garden. At its center, a bronze statue of a young woman holding a book close to her heart, Clara Reynolds. Beneath her feet, an inscription read, "Truth is never lost. It only waits for the right hands to unearth it." Her story became a turning point for Denton County's justice system. A new cold case unit was established, dedicated to revisiting other unresolved disappearances across Texas. Within the first 2 years, 3 more cases were reopened, one of which led to another posthumous confession. Clara's family, those who remained, attended the memorial's unveiling. Her niece, now in her 70s, stood with tears streaming down her cheeks as the crowd fell silent. "All these years," she whispered to a journalist, "we thought she ran away. Turns out, she never left us. She was right here, waiting to be found." The media frenzy eventually quieted, but the emotional wake lingered. Denton's residents spoke in softer tones now, more aware of the stories that linger beneath the surface of their small town. Teachers began incorporating the case into high school ethics lessons. College students wrote dissertations on the impact of power, corruption, and silence in mid-century America. And every spring, on the anniversary of Clara's disappearance, candles are placed along the garden path at dusk. Locals gather without ceremony, just silence, reflection, and the distant sound of a church bell that no longer rings. It's said that justice, even delayed, has a sound of its own, a quiet reckoning that moves through generations until it's finally heard. Clara's voice was finally heard. There's something haunting about the way time buries truth. 60 years, enough for faces to fade from photos, for names to be whispered only in passing, for guilt to turn into myth. Yet beneath all that silence, the truth waited. It always does. 4 decades, people walked by St. Mary's Chapel unaware of what rested beneath its foundation. Children played near its steps. Couples exchanged vows under the same stained glass that once cast light on a murderer's face. The irony was almost poetic, the perfect mask of holiness concealing a crime too dark to speak aloud. But time, as it often does, carved cracks into that mask. A forgotten ledger here. A misplaced photo there. Small, almost invisible signs that refused to stay buried. It's almost as if Clara herself whispered through the years, guiding hands and hearts toward her truth. The soil didn't just give up her remains, it gave up a secret, a warning, and a plea for remembrance. Every cold case carries that same invisible thread, the quiet persistence of the human voice that refuses to die. And when we listen closely enough, the truth comes alive again. Not for justice alone, but for peace. For acknowledgement. For closure. Clara's story reminds us that evil doesn't always wear the face of a stranger. Sometimes, it hides behind the pulpit, the uniform, or the neighbor's smile. It reminds us that silence can be as dangerous as the crime itself, that choosing not to ask questions can make us part of the lie. When you stand before her memorial today, surrounded by the whisper of wind through oak leaves, you can almost hear her, soft but steady, "You found me." And in that whisper lies the purpose of every investigation, every reopened file, every sleepless night spent searching for the missing piece. Because in the end, truth is not just about solving cases. It's about giving back a voice that time tried to steal. Every mystery has a voice. And today, we've heard hers. Justice, when it finally came, was quiet, almost humble in its arrival. There were no grand court scenes, no headlines screaming for attention. Just a small ceremony beneath a Texas sunset, where Clara's remaining relatives stood hand in hand as her case file was officially marked closed. The police chief, gray and worn from decades of service, laid a single white rose beside her memorial plaque. His voice trembled as he said, "She waited 60 years for this day. And we thank her for not letting us forget." Father Harold's name was finally stripped from the town's chapel records. His portrait was removed from the church hallway where it had hung for generations, a smiling image of a man who had fooled them all. In its place, the townspeople decided to mount a framed photograph of Clara herself, her soft eyes now immortalized as a symbol of truth reclaimed. Beneath it, the words read, "Let no silence protect the guilty." The college where she once studied introduced a new elective in forensic ethics, designed to teach students how time, faith, and fear often conspire to bury the truth. Clara's name became part of that curriculum. Not as a victim, but as a teacher, an unspoken mentor who turned her tragedy into lessons for the living. In the months that followed, something remarkable happened. Tips began to pour in from nearby counties. Other unsolved disappearances. Other names that had gone cold. As if Clara's case had opened a door long kept shut. The team of investigators, now known statewide for their persistence, adopted her case as their emblem. They wore small lapel pins shaped like a white rose, a reminder of what it meant to keep searching, even when hope had been declared dead. And perhaps, in some unseen way, Clara's spirit guided them still, leading them toward other buried truths, other stories waiting to be heard. Because that's what justice really is. It isn't always a trial or a prison cell. Sometimes, it's the echo of a voice finally acknowledged, the ripple effect of truth that keeps spreading long after the cameras stop rolling. 60 years ago, a young woman disappeared into the quiet of a Texas night. Today, her story echoes through time, not as tragedy, but as testament. Every mystery leaves behind a voice. And in this one, justice finally spoke.